Welcome to The Performance Show, a videocast interviewing athletes, coaches and sports scientists from around the globe. Please welcome your host, Lachlan Puyol from Puyol Athletic Development and Performance.
Welcome to episode 19 of The Performance Show. Dr. Trisha VanDusseldorp from Kennesaw State joins us today. So Trisha is the assistant professor of exercise science. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
No problem. So a big topic of today, carbohydrate loading, protein supplementation, amino acids, molecular and hormonal responses to exercise. Let's start on protein supplementation, starting with non-essential and essential amino acids. You see that around in a GMC, at supplement stores. Just for the average person out there who doesn't have that sort of exercise science background, how would you differentiate the two?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're starting with information on protein, you definitely need to know the difference between essential and non-essential proteins. So essential proteins, they're often referred to as indispensable proteins. So indispensable, meaning that we cannot synthesize them from the metabolic intermediates in our bodies. We have to consume them as part of our diet. And we actually have 9 of them. Some textbooks you'll see 8. Some textbooks you'll see 10. And the reason that you see kind of some variations in those numbers is an individual may have some sort of genetic disorder that doesn't allow them to create a certain amino acid, but most texts say 9 essential amino acids. And then non-essential amino acids, those amino acids we can actually create in the body. So we don't necessarily have to consume them in our diet, even though it's highly recommended that we do so. Some of the most popular essential amino acids are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. So those are our branched chain amino acids. And they just get that name because of their chemical structure. So they have a branched side.
And when we look at those BCAAs, the 3 that you mentioned, is there high evidence for mitigating fatigue, attenuating muscle damage post-exercise?
It's a great question. I did my dissertation on branched chain amino acids when I was at the University of New Mexico. So it was about 7 years ago we conducted that study. And at that time, branched chain amino acids were really, really hot. And they still currently are a multi-million-dollar industry. If you go into GNC, if you go into Vitamin Shop, you're going to see BCAAs on the shelf. And it's to date, right? It's really, 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 really debated whether or not they are actually going to be beneficial for exercise recovery, beneficial for improving or decreasing, we would say, fatigue or upregulating skeletal muscle protein synthesis. More so, here's the key, than something like a complete protein, whey protein, casein protein, or even whole food based proteins. And so no one could, and this is where you get into, let's talk about what the evidence is, what's the literature say. So yes, there is research to support that branched chain amino acids will indeed reduce protein degradation and skeletal muscle enzyme release. So something like creatine kinase is highly studied as a marker of muscle damage. And if you supplement with BCAAs following intense exercise, there's been research to show, indeed, yeah, CK can decrease. There is research to show that branched chain amino acids will reduce perceived soreness in post-exercise periods. It's often shown with resistance exercise populations following intense exercise, so with lots of damage. And then one of the most interesting areas with branched chain amino acids is actually central fatigue in endurance exercise. There's been 5 studies. I think the first one was in 1998, and up until today, where there's research on BCAA supplementation, decreasing tryptophan. And if you decrease tryptophan, you actually decrease a marker called 5-HT, and that's responsible for central fatigue, they say. So yeah, there's been some research. Now that's one side. There's another side, especially in the sports nutrition world, where you say, is branched chain amino acid supplementation better than a complete protein, like I was highlighting a little bit ago? And typically we would say likely not. And that comparison, extremely limited in the scientific research. So it's an area that's understudied comparing BCAAs to whey protein or complete proteins in terms of human research. Animal models, it's there, but you could go back and forth. I always say there's a time and a place for a given supplement. If you aren't a fan of something heavy, like a meal post-exercise that contains protein, beef, chicken, and you are more interested in a supplement, but you don't want something that's milky, like a milk-based whey protein, then sure, branched chains are going to be better than a placebo, all right, than nothing. So you could go with that, perhaps.
So interesting, and we always think about peripheral fatigue, so i.e. muscular fatigue when we think of BCAAs. Now, when you mention central fatigue, we're thinking more the central nervous system. Obviously, that plays a huge role in strength training. Is there benefit on attenuating more central fatigue with branched chain amino acids?
Absolutely. Reducing central fatigue has allowed, especially in exhaustive endurance exercise, for endurance athletes to actually go longer, perform at higher intensities. Absolutely. Now, in regards to central fatigue and resistance exercise, I don't know of any studies that have been done on that, but endurance athletes, go for it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And when we just to turn the topic on back to normal proteins, isolate versus concentrate, when you see that at GNC, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah. So at GNC, at Vitamin Shop, you'll see something like whey protein concentrate, whey protein isolate, and then hydrolyzed whey. So hydrolysis. And the difference is in how they're processed. So they're all milk-based proteins. And a milk-based protein is, if you're talking about whey, it's 80% whey, 20% casein. And so you take that whey and you filter it. And you filter it and you filter it and you filter it, and you'll get different types of whey protein supplements. The first one, whey protein concentrate, has protein, of course, typically about 80% protein. And then the remaining, you're going to get mostly fat and lactose. And so if you have that protein, high quality protein source, great for upregulating muscle protein synthesis, preventing muscle protein breakdown, great in the post-exercise period. Tends to be cheaper than whey protein isolate, which is then filtered again. The whey protein concentrate is filtered to create a whey protein isolate. And so you're just breaking that down, breaking those amino acids down, and you're getting a whey protein isolate that's about 90% protein, 90% protein. And the big thing about whey protein isolate is that you are reducing the lactose. And so if you're lactose intolerant, then that would be ideal for you. And it tends to be a little bit more expensive than whey protein concentrate. Whey protein isolate is actually the most popularly consumed protein on the market. There are a lot of good brands out there. And if you want to spend even more money, they'll take that isolate and they'll actually break down those amino acids even more, and you'll get what is considered more a pre-digested protein. So you get this pre-digested protein, which means you just have shorter amino acid links and smaller ones that are easily taken up and digested in the body. And you're getting very similar concentrations in lactose, less fat typically, but very similar in protein content, not really worth the money typically. Usually whey protein isolate or concentrate will get the job done.
And there's other ergogenic aids. I know carnitine or omega-6, other ergogenic aids or supplements. Hydrogen ion build-up after resistance exercise is one of those things that cause fatigue, especially peripherally, when you get this acidity in the cell. Now, carnitine, I mean, the evidence sort of says that it's a hydrogen buffer. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like carnitine as a supplement is effective? at attenuating the hydrogen buildup?
You know, so there's been one research study that actually has shown that it will reduce muscle damage. It does help with buffering, but the majority of research actually shows it's not really worth spending money on. And so L-carnitine actually was really popularized because of its increased lipolytic action. So it breaks down fatty acids. A lot of people started taking it because they thought it would help them lose weight. That research, not so much. And really, if they are losing weight, it's typically attributed in literature because they're engaging in more physical activity at that point. And so it's really not your best option as a buffer or for reducing muscle damage. Omega-6 or omega-3 fatty acids, fish oils, we've done some research in that area, really cool area of research. There's research where you've got omega-3s with protein actually reducing protein thresholds, meaning that you can get a better amino acid protein, muscle protein synthetic response if you're combining protein with fish oils, omega-3s. And then there's research on omega-3 fatty acids, so EPA, DHA, reducing perceived soreness, reducing enzymatic muscle damage, so CK release. And that research that we did. We actually did a dose response study, 2 grams, 4 grams, and 6 grams. And we showed that 6 grams, actually the higher dosage, which is quite a bit, was the best. But there's some evidence to show that 3 grams is beneficial as well.
So sort of combining the protein and another supplement like omega-6 or omega-3, as you were saying, can really enhance the protein response.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And if you were to combine carbohydrate and protein, is that beneficial as well?
Mm-hmm. It absolutely is. Sometimes there's research, especially in animal models. Now, animal model research translating to human research isn't always perfect. But there is research that has shown that in the post-exercise period that carbohydrate and protein combinations consumed upregulate muscle protein synthesis faster than just protein alone or carbohydrate alone. Now, if you're talking about glycogen restoration, so restoring glycogen, especially of interest to an endurance athlete, especially an endurance athlete that is going to have 2 events within a 24-hour period, then combining carbohydrate and protein that protein addition actually enhances carbohydrate uptake. So glycogen storage in skeletal muscle. And there's really cool research on that. It's been around for a while. Yeah.
And if we zoom into the cellular level, the microscopic level, is that sort of more of a cell receptor mechanism of why it's more beneficial, kind of working together?
Yeah, absolutely. So carbohydrate is known to promote insulin release, right? So insulin is released into the blood so we can take up that glucose. When you have insulin binding at the muscle cell level, you actually have a blockage. So you decrease, and I should say a blockage of muscle protein breakdown. So insulin is responsible for preventing catabolism, we would say, and you get even more of a push towards mTOR upregulation, so mammalian target of rapamycin, which we consider, the king regulator, right, of muscle protein synthesis. So we want mTOR to go up if we want anabolism, muscle building.
And when we talk about carbohydrates, you see kids saying, "Yep, carbs are great. Let's load up on carbs the day before an event or a match." However, there are different types of carbohydrates. Some are good, some break down really, really quickly. Could you elaborate into that sort of a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have simple and complex carbohydrates, right? So we've got mono and disaccharides. Monosaccharide, for example, glucose, and disaccharides. So they're going to be small, short chain sugars, we would say. They're going to be taken up quickly. They're going to cause an increase in blood glucose very quickly. Complex carbohydrates, longer chains of our sugars, right? They're more complex and they're going to take longer to digest. So some good examples. I often use things like fruit juice is a simple carbohydrate, But something that's more complex would be like a banana or strawberries. Now they're both, we're considering them fruits, right? But fiber content, fiber is a complex carbohydrate that's going to slow digestion in those fruits. So fruits, vegetables, whole grain bread, those are all complex carbohydrates. Oatmeal, really, really popular as a pre-exercise meal, 1 to 4 hours before. Somebody has some oatmeal, full wheat toast, complex carbohydrates. More simple sugars, something along the lines of Gatorade or Powerade are popular examples. And that's why we take those in while we're exercising, because it's going to provide the body with this glucose rush, provide the body with the energy it needs right away while you're performing.
Now, in an athlete with a chronic condition, so let's just say type 1 or type 2 diabetes, would you suggest anything different with that sort of population?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have to be really, really, really careful with glucose regulation in those populations. Typically, we use complex carbohydrates for the most part, unless we're experiencing really low blood glucose for some reason, then we would give something that would overload the system. So something like a simple carbohydrate. That's a great question. And in type 2 and type 1 diabetics, they perform exercise just as well as somebody who doesn't have diabetes, as long as you're regulating that glucose. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you mentioned mTOR before, and as we know, that's a anabolic molecule or protein produced by the cell in response to resistance training. Now, we've also got testosterone, which is anabolic as well. That's a hormone, which is different, right? So how would the interplay of testosterone and mTOR, given that they're both anabolic, how would they kind of be different in the protein synthesis process?
Yeah, testosterone is an interesting topic. You're bringing up all the fiery ones today, because it's highly debated whether testosterone is super, super important for anabolism. When you're talking about testosterone, it works in a variety of pathways. So you could use Wnt signaling is one area that testosterone works. So that's going to cause anabolism. You also have satellite cell activation from testosterone, and it will increase mTOR activation as well. And so you get this IGF-1 flow through the system. And so you kind of get, if you think about it biochemically, you're thinking, okay, if I get testosterone increases and mTOR, am I going to get, a bigger bang for my buck in a sense? And really in the post-exercise period, resistance training, if we're talking, testosterone tends to stay elevated for about 60 minutes. You'll see an increase 10 to 15 minutes, that peak, and then it comes back down about 60 minutes post exercise. And whether that is like extremely, extremely, extremely crucial for muscle protein synthesis is still highly debated. Now, if you cut testosterone off in animal models, then we notice atrophy. So we would say that in a sense, it seems to be important, but is it the everything to muscle protein synthesis? No, it seems like you need both mTOR signaling and testosterone just to get that peak and then back down. We don't need prolonged testosterone to increase hypertrophy unless you want extreme hypertrophy like anabolic steroid type anabolism, right? That's a whole different super physiological story for sure. Yeah.
And we know that mTOR is upregulated in response to resistance training. Is it also upregulated based on your fed state, fuel sources in the body?
Yes, absolutely. So there's some really cool research on pre-exercise protein feeding and carbohydrate feeding. So if you actually provide the body with a nutrient such as protein or carbohydrate pre-exercise, and then you start exercising where you enter into more of a catabolic state, you enter into less of a catabolic state by feeding pre-exercise. So absolutely, you'll get some mTOR activation that typically rides out for about 3 hours, and then you can feed again, and then you'll get another spike in mTOR activation. But absolutely, you're going to start getting some muscle protein synthetic response in response to nutrient feeding pre-exercise. And then post-exercise, as well. You want to get out of that catabolic state as quickly as possible. So feeding to get out of catabolism, upregulate mTOR is really, really important.
Yeah, and that sort of brings us over to concurrent training, where if someone is doing strength training twice a week, they're doing aerobic conditioning 2 or 3 times a week, we would theoretically we should see more of a catabolic state with the strenuous muscle breakdown. Is there a different mTOR response with aerobic training compared to resistance training?
Yes, absolutely. So if you're doing more aerobic-based exercise, you tend to upregulate a system known as AMPK. So you get this AMPK activation that causes a downregulation in muscle protein synthesis. And AMPK is responsible for upregulating these degradation pathways, such as the UP system or autophagy system. And so when you enter into that catabolic state, you want to, as quickly as possible, upregulate muscle protein synthesis. So it is crucial for endurance athletes to make sure that they're getting in enough protein and carbohydrate, because carbohydrate will help block that degradation pathway and upregulate. And it's not 100% block. I should use it more as I teach it as like a dimmer switch, right? So you're going to dim that degradation pathway and you're going to upregulate mTOR and muscle protein synthesis. And endurance athletes, they tend to be like, oh, carbohydrate, that's the most important, which indeed for their performance it is, but protein's also important as well. So they can reduce that breakdown, that catabolic state, and upregulate mTOR and that anabolic state.
And in men, obviously, being a male, the testosterone production is 10-fold higher than what we'd see in a female. Would that alter their mTOR response to get into that anabolic state?
It doesn't typically make a huge difference between males and females. Now, absolute anabolism and muscle protein synthesis that leads to hypertrophy, if you're looking at absolute amounts per pound of body weight, then men tend to, or if you're looking at absolute amounts of lean body mass that can be gained in men, absolutely, they put on more than women, but relative, it tends to be very, very, very similar. Yeah. Lean body mass per pound of body weight. Yeah. And
I work with a lot of kids, strength conditioning with kids, performance training, and 10 or 20 years ago, and even it's stigmatized today that why would you put a kid in the gym? It's going to stunt their growth. It's going to have all these negative effects, but we don't really see, because they don't produce testosterone until they hit puberty.
Exactly.
So what are kind of the responses that we'd see in kids, and how is it still beneficial?
Yep, we haven't done a ton of research on just general testosterone responses to exercise, but in terms of training for them, it is super, super beneficial for them to actually be in the weight room, lifting weights, engaging in cardiovascular exercise. Typically, concurrent training tends to be the best for them. So you're not overloading joints and ligaments with too much resistance exercise. You're not overdoing it in the aerobic area, but you have a little bit of both. And then as they get older into the high school area, they may tend to specialize in certain sports, but absolutely getting them in the weight room, having them exercise and training is highly recommended. Typically, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no, you keep going. Sorry.
No, absolutely, go ahead.
I was gonna ask if kids and adolescents engage in too much endurance training, would that deter the mTOR pathway and skeletal muscle production?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you engage in too much exercise, and I can't think of, a specific study that's actually looked at this, but in adults, and specifically in children, but in adults, you get into this state of overtraining, and you get into this caloric deficit and this hypocaloric status. You get too much cortisol, you get this stress increase in cortisol is catabolic. So you're going to absolutely impair anabolism, and you're gonna upregulate catabolism more so than you want. And I would assume that would be very similar in children. Children tend to be a little bit more resilient though than adults. they tend to be able to handle a little bit more sometimes than us as we get older. But you definitely want to be careful for sure. They're going to have very similar cortisol responses. They're going to have that is shown in the adult research.
And how many times per week should kids engage in strength and resistance training?
Yeah, the ACSM guidelines, American College of Sports Medicine, recommends 2 to 3 times per week for children. And that recommendation is very similar to adults. Adults, especially those who are really into resistance training, may train 4, even 6 times a week, but 2 to 3 times, absolutely, for children.
Yeah. Trisha, thank you so much for your time and for coming on. You gave such good insights that I'm sure would really benefit coaches across the states and through the rest of the world. So, really appreciate your time, and that was wonderful.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
Oh, for sure.